right, thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Jiyae Hwang. I am a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we're going to spend some time to discuss the E2 visa requirements with a focus on risky cases, which primarily means cases where the investment amount is low, or there could be other reasons why a case could be risky. Just a few things to discuss before we get started. So some of you may know that the firm, Scott Legal, was actually founded on an E2 visa 10 years ago. The founder of the firm applied for an E2 visa to come to the United States to establish Scott Legal. The firm has successfully renewed its E2 visa as well. So this gives us very deep familiarity and expertise with E2 visas. Scott Legal is a full-service immigration law firm, but we do focus primarily on E2 visas. We have processed hundreds and hundreds of them, and we process many E2 visas that are higher risk, which includes cases with lower investment amounts. We have processed at consulates around the world, but our primary two consulates are Toronto and London. We will be continuing this webinar series, and we are doing at least 2 webinars a month on different immigration law related topics. And at the end of this webinar, we will be sending out a few resources to all participants. First, we will send out a copy of the PowerPoint that will be used in this webinar. Second, we will also send you a comprehensive guide to the E2 visa that you can use as a resource. We can also send you a link that you can follow to sign up for any additional webinars that are coming up in the future, and also a link to this webinar as it will be recorded. This webinar will also be made available on YouTube, and we encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button on the channel as we regularly upload a variety of immigration law related videos. Finally, we'll send you a link that you can follow to set up a consultation with one of our lawyers should you wish to discuss your case further. As for today's panelists, we are lucky to have Kelly Weiner, who is the managing partner of the firm, who has a leading expertise on processing a wide variety of E2 visa cases. Finally, for any questions you may have, please feel free to add them to the chat box or use the Q&A function, and we will try and get to all questions. So without further delay, I will start the presentation. So let's start with explaining the basic requirements for eligibility for the E2 visa. And as a general overview, the E2 visa is a non-immigrant visa for investors who are seeking to come to the United States to develop and direct a U.S. enterprise that they have invested in. Now, the E2 visa is not an immigrant visa, and the E2 visa won't necessarily directly lead to a green card, but it is possible for the E2 visa holder to continue extending the E2 visa indefinitely as long as the applicant continues to meet all E2 requirements. Now, to qualify for the E2 visa, it is possible to do so through purchasing an existing business in the United States or starting up a new enterprise in the United States. So let's look at the requirements. So the first requirement, you must be a national of a treaty country. This means the applicant's nationality must be one of the countries that have signed a economic treaty with the United States. And if you're curious of the list of the treaty countries, you can Google, Treaty Countries Department of State, and you will see a list of participating countries in the E2 visa program. And this includes many countries in Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East, and some common examples are, the UK, Mexico, Canada, Chile, Philippines, and the list is updated from time to time. For example, Israel was added relatively recently for the E2. And the applicant must also own at least 50% of the E2 company. The third requirement is that the applicant must make an investment. And the investment must be, quote unquote, at risk, which means the money has actually been spent towards, either establishing the business or purchasing the business before applying for the visa. And as opposed to just transferring funds to the E2 business bank account, such as it is just money sitting in a bank account that will not be considered funds put at risk. And the amount of such investment must be substantial. there is no hard and fast minimum with regards to a dollar amount in terms of how much investment counts as substantial. However, the investment amount must be sufficient in terms of making all expenditures that are necessary to start the business and get it operational. Some typical E2 expenditures towards meeting the substantiality requirement includes spending funds on inventory, equipment, setting up a business website, purchasing office supplies that you may need, renting office space, commercial warehouse space, spending on marketing. You can hire services to set up a marketing infrastructure for your business. You can also include the money you have spent on setting up the business entity. For example, incorporating a corporation, registering an LLC, things like that. Now, there is another option for putting funds at risk, and this option is available to situations where you're purchasing a business as opposed to starting up a business. So if you're starting up a business, it is true that you must spend on concrete, expenditures to, show that you have put sufficient money at risk. Now, when you're purchasing a business, there is an option that you can use a third-party escrow account for the purchase, as long as the sole condition of the release of the money from the escrow account is the approval of the E2 visa. So this really, serves to protect investors in case the E2 visa is denied, right? So when you're setting up the business purchase with the U.S. business seller, you can arrange it such that the purchase, the money that you spend towards the purchase is placed on an escrow account before you apply for the E2 visa. And once the E2 visa is approved, the funds you put in the escrow can be released to the seller. So that is another option you can use to prove that you have spent sufficient money to meet the substantiality requirement. Now, the other requirement is that the business cannot be marginal. And what does this mean? So marginality relates to the revenue generation potential of the business. So this means the E2 business cannot really be what I call a one-person shop. So the profitability of the business cannot be marginal. The revenues must be sufficient not only to just support the investor and his or her family, but also enough to hire U.S. workers. And our recommendation is to employ at least 3 to 4 full-time employees within the next 5 years of operation. The other requirement is that the business must be real and operating, or that the business is ready to start running once the visa is granted, or that the business is already taking revenue. This means all of the required steps to get the business up and running must already have been completed. For example, the business entity must already have been established in the United States. Business space, such as a commercial lease, must have already been signed and executed. If you require a license to operate a business in a particular area, all required licenses must have been obtained or will be obtained in a very short period of time after you come into the United States. And it is also helpful for this requirement if you already have client contracts for services or your business offerings, that you already have these contracts in place. The other requirement is that the applicant must be coming to the United States solely to develop and direct the E2 business. This means once you're approved for the E2 visa, you cannot start working for other entities in the United States. You should only work for your E2 business. Also, your primary role in the E2 business must be running the business, though not necessarily working as an employee or a worker, but to really focus on managing the business, and the government will expect you to hire more employees to perform on-the-ground work while you're in the United States. So the last requirement that we'll talk about is the intent to return. So as I mentioned before, the E2 visa is a non-immigrant visa, and the applicant must show that they have an intent to return to their home country upon the expiration of the E2 visa. And this requirement is usually satisfied by a signed statement of the applicant to that effect. All right, so let's dig a little deeper on the requirements, who can apply, how long does the E2 visa last? As I mentioned in the earlier slide, the E2 Treaty Investor Visa is a non-immigrant visa, which allows nationals of certain countries to come to the United States to develop and direct the operations of an enterprise in which he or she has invested. And there are two options for obtaining an E2 visa. The first option is you can purchase an existing business in the United States. The second option is that you can start up your own enterprise in the United States. So in order for someone to apply for an E2 visa, there must be a treaty between the United States and the country of which they are a national. And as I alluded to in the previous slide, many countries in all continents do participate in the E2 visa program. The list is updated from time to time. For example, Israel was added relatively recently. Certain countries, common countries that do not participate, examples include China and India and Russia. Those are some countries that do not participate. So definitely check the list to verify that your country of nationality is indeed participating in the E2 program at the time you apply. Now, another thing to clarify is that being a national of a country means having a passport of that country. So this does not depend on the country of birth. And it is an important distinction because in other contexts, the country of birth is what matters. But in the E2 visa context, you only need to be a national of a treaty country to qualify. For example, if you're a dual national of two countries, and for one of the countries, the E2 visa, it is an E2 visa participating country, then you can use, your nationality for that treaty country to qualify for the E2 visa. So the other question to talk about is how long is an E2 visa valid for? And actually, the length of validity of an E2 visa varies quite greatly depending on your country of nationality. And you can also search for information about this when you Google Department of State reciprocity schedule. You can look up per country of the arrangement of exactly how long they're going to issue the visa for. And actually, for many countries that participate in the E2 visa program, the visa can be issued for up to 5 years, which can be pretty convenient for many nationals. However, it can also be as short as 3 months, the visa. And when we're discussing the validity of the visa, one thing that is important to note is that the validity of a visa stamp is different from the validity. It's different from the length of time that you get when you're admitted into the United States on the E2 visa. So what does that mean? So the validity of the visa is the length of time between which you are allowed to use the visa to travel to the United States. It is kind of like a ticket to come into the United States. Now, once you're coming into the United States, you will be given a period of time where you're allowed to stay in the United States while you're here to develop and direct your business on the E2 status. And every time you come in, you will get a 2-year validity of your period of authorized stay where you are given E2 status to stay in the United States to develop your business. So this means even if, your visa stamp validity is short, like 3 months, as long as you come into the United States within the validity period of the 3 months, once you're there, you'll be given a period of 2 years to develop and direct your business. So there is a difference between the visa validity and the validity of your status, the authorized length of authorized stay once you're in the United States. All right, so we'll move on to the next slide. So how much investment is enough when you're considering applying for an E2 visa for the purpose of meeting the substantiality requirement, the requirement that the investment must be substantial? Now, as I mentioned before, there is no hard and fast minimum dollar amount in regulations or law on how much investment is required for it to be substantial. And really, what amount will be considered a substantial investment will depend on the type of business being started. So for example, in general, if you are planning to start up a office type consulting business, for example, which depend on, the provision of services, does not require, much expensive equipment or warehouse or inventory or things like that. Those kinds of businesses would typically require a lower amount to start up because of the, fewer variety of upfront costs that you need to start that kind of business. For example, you can start such a business with a lease, some computer equipment, some furniture for the office. However, if your plan is to start a different type of business that requires a higher upfront cost to start, such as a restaurant, a manufacturing company, a retail store, for example, those types of businesses, typically consulates would expect to see a higher amount of funds invested in order for the investment to be considered substantial. Now, the government uses what is called a proportionality test to gauge the substantiality of an investment. Now, the smaller the total cost needed to set up or purchase a business, the higher proportion of these costs must already have been spent. So for example, for a small consulting company that will require, for example, $80,000 to set up or purchase, the government will expect the applicant to already have spent 100% of the $80,000 required. By contrast, if it is a 100 million business that the applicant is investing in, the applicant would likely also be considered to have made a substantial investment, even if they spent 10% of the total value of the business, if you put in 10 million into that business, for example. So in respect to the proportionality, a smaller proportion of the business's total value would be expected to meet the substantiality requirement based on the higher value of the business. Let's now talk a little bit about the proportionality test as applied to situations when you're trying to apply for the E2 visa based on purchasing a business as opposed to starting up a business. Now, the exercise here is to compare the cost it took for you to buy the business to the fair market value of the business. So what does this mean? So if you bought the business in the open market, you likely pay the fair market value, and that will likely be considered a substantial investment. However, if you did not buy the business in the open market or, were introduced to the business opportunity through closed channels, through somebody perhaps, it could be a good idea to get a independent CPA letter that can, confirm that the purchase price that you actually paid is equivalent to the fair market value of the business. So this comparison is what the government will do when asking the question, is the investment substantial? All right, so we will move on to the next topic. So what are some strategies to deal with a low dollar amount in terms of the investment amount? So one approach that we will recommend is really ask yourself, what is the overall strength of the E2 application? And what this means is if the other aspects of an E2 case are strong, then it could be okay even if the general investment amount is relatively lower. And what does this mean? So one approach is if you can show strong evidence towards the real and operating requirement, right? So if the business already has contracts with clients in place, if the business can get letters of intent from potential clients, confirming their intent to, hire the company's services, if it's a service-oriented company, or to, market the company's goods, if it is a product-based company. Such as, if you already have purchase orders for products and contracts related to that, you can also submit those. You can also get letters from organizations in the local area that you are planning to set up your business, such as the local Chamber of Commerce. Another good approach to this is if you already have hired a U.S. employee, right? And if you have already hired the U.S. employee and the business is already taking revenue, for example, That can also be a way to boost the overall strength of the E2 application, even if your investment amount is relatively low. So let's talk a little bit about two examples. In the first example, let's assume that you have invested a particular amount. Let's say you've invested $80,000. Let's say you already hired 2 employees, and the business has already started taking revenue. And actually, the business is taking significant revenue. Let's say around $80,000 per month. You're already making that revenue. And you already have, you can already provide contracts evidencing you have 10 clients, which really evidences that not only the business is ready to go because it's already providing services, but also clearly meets the marginality requirement because you have already shown that you can support the 2 US jobs for US employees. Now let's talk about another example. Let's compare that with example 2. Let's say you're investing in E2, investing in a business for an E2 visa. You invested the same amount, $80,000. However, let's say there are no other strengthening facts, right? You don't want to invest any more money, and you don't want to hire anyone until after your E2 visa is approved and you come to the United States. In that case, it could be a riskier case because the consulate could find that your investment amount was not enough. That not enough has been done to allow the business to really be real and operating and to hire, US workers, support US jobs, and to start generating revenue. There is little evidence to, convince the consulate otherwise. In that way, this could be a riskier case. All right, so we'll move on to the next slide. So now then, let's talk a little bit about what are some common E2 visa expenditures. Where are some areas that you can, spend funds in to boost the investment amount, when you're preparing for an E2 visa application for a startup. So here is the list of certain common categories. Really, they include legitimate investments that, is reasonably required to set up a business and to get it to operational shape, right? So commonly, you would, rent business office space, execute a commercial lease for that, pay security deposit, pay the rent. And it is also possible to prepay some of the rent, even for the entire year. And that could help get the investment amount up to a higher amount. Now, equipment. A variety of equipment is also a very common E2 expenditure you can consider spending on. This can include computer equipment, such as printer, scanner, tablets, laptop, and related accessories. You could also consider spending on marketing and advertising. And that could also be good because it shows the consulate that the business has a system ready in place to attract clients and develop the business's book of clients. So marketing and advertising is certainly what you can spend on. Other types of fees that could count as E2 expenditures, including licensing fees, for example, if it's required for a business. If you hire employees, any money that you spend on setting up the employee payroll and any salary that you pay for your employees can also be included as part of your startup costs for setting up the E2 business. If you hire an accountant, for example, for accounting services, you can also include those costs. Now, there are certain expenditures that are generally considered more favorable to be counted as part of the E2 investment. And there are other types of expenditures that are not as favorable to count among the E2 expenditures. So let's do a little bit of a comparison on what can be strong expenditures versus weaker expenditures. Right. So one thing that I forgot to mention in the previous slide is, regarding spending on a vehicle, a car. So that can be, a strong and or weak expenditures depending on the facts of your case, right? So if you're buying the vehicle to, just use as a means of transportation to and from home for an office type business, for example, that would be not a favorable type of expense because it is hard to show the business necessity for, spending on that vehicle. However, let's say that if you are, starting a landscaping business or a consulting business, construction business, right? Or a cleaning business where you do have equipment to transport, if you have, need to transport workers from here and there for those types of gigs, a company vehicle may be a legitimate type of expense to count. So counting a company vehicle is definitely dependent on the facts, individual facts of your particular business. Other types of riskier expenditures include travel expenses such as flights. So even if you bought plane tickets to come to the United States to meet potential business partners and talk to potential clients, we would typically not include travel expenses, including flights, in the investment schedule when we're submitting an E2 application, because it's a little bit more questionable on whether those can count as a E2 investment. In a similar vein, if you purchase a hotel accommodation for participation in such conferences and other business related, even if it's a business related event, we would typically not include the cost of accommodations for such happenings. And meals, also, even if you purchase meals for a client meeting for business development purposes, we would typically not include the cost of those meals in the investment schedule. Similarly, in a similar vein, for entertainment costs and things like that would not be a good type of expenditure to include. Other types of expenses that we would not generally include are expenses that will eventually be directly reimbursed by a client or customer. If you are, pre-purchasing certain services or products that you will eventually resell to customers, for example, we would not include the cost that would eventually be reimbursed. The final example of a risky expense to include are expenses paid to related parties. So, for example, if your brother is a web designer and you happen to pay your brother a huge amount of money to design your website for a business, that may be, worth reconsidering if you really want to include that expense in your investment schedule. It could raise some questions on whether that was a bona fide investment item. All right, so at this point then, I will turn it over to Kelly, who will continue to take us through some of the other questions that come up regarding riskier E2 cases.
Thank you, Jiyae. Perfect. So we wanted to talk about some common challenges and tips for consulting businesses, because this is, I think, a very common type of case for E2s and for people who are kind of looking to open a small business or transition out of working, for a larger employer. They often ask if a consulting business is viable for the E2, and it is, very viable, but does require some kind of additional considerations because these types of cases can be scrutinized more heavily, by the consulates and the government. So one of the issues with consulting businesses is that theoretically you could start this business, with very little startup capital. We have many clients come to us and say, I have my expertise, I have connections, I have a laptop, I do not need to spend any more money. But ultimately the E2 is an investor visa, and there does have to be a substantial investment that is irrevocably, committed so that they feel comfortable that the investor is going to actually work on making this business a success. So ultimately what we try to advise clients to do is think about what expenditures would you maybe have, in your first year of operations or even going into your second year of operations, and try to bring some of those forward so that you're spending money on things that you actually need for the business. You're not just kind of wasting money, but, basically acknowledging you do need to be spending, $20, $30, $40, $50,000, to have a viable E2 application, depending on kind of which consulate you're at, or whether you're applying with USCIS, maybe a lower or higher amount may be more feasible. So think about, can you prepay for office space? Sometimes some office spaces will allow you to prepay for some, length of time. For equipment, maybe you were putting off getting a new laptop or a new phone. Maybe you make those purchases now. Perhaps you were going to, proceed with a really bare bones website, but instead work with a PR firm, work with a marketing professional, get a more optimized website, up front. Those types of expenses are very good, particularly for consulting companies where they're sometimes worried, how are you going to market yourself? How are you going to get clients? Another thing you can do is hire employees. So for consulting businesses, one concern they have is that someone's going to come in and just be a solo consultant. And for the E2, you do need to show that the business is going to support more than just the investor and their family. You do need to show it's going to hire workers and make a significant economic contribution. So if you've already hired employees, it can help in two ways. One is it addresses that concern. It shows the officer, we are going to hire people. We already have hired someone. And then it also helps bolster the investment amount, because anything you've paid to that employee at the time of filing, you can include. And then any ancillary expenses related to the employee, like, insurance, payroll providers, things like that, all of that can be utilized as part of the investment as well. And then, equipment that you have to buy for that employee, or let's say you plan to hire, 2 or 3 employees by the end of the year, maybe you get their computers up front instead of waiting until you hire them to buy the computers. So there are just certain things that you could consider to try to buy things that will be useful for the business and will be necessary down the line, just to kind of get the investment amount high enough that it could qualify for an E2. All right. So another kind of high risk, E2 option are E2 visas related to real estate. So it is, I think, a very common, misconception that you can, kind of purchase a home or purchase some piece of property and maybe rent it out and kind of use that for an E2 business. So this is generally not going to work. It's not considered to be an active, real, and operating enterprise if you own a property as a passive owner and you just collect rental income. So just kind of purchasing a property, putting it in the name of an LLC, having a real estate holding company where you just own property on which you collect rent, that's generally not going to, be active enough to qualify, for, the E2 visa. And in fact, you can see how common it is because many consulates on their website in the FAQ section even have a question that says, can I purchase a property and put it in the name of an LLC and get a visa? And they say no. So they are very aware of this, so something to keep in mind. That if you are going to do a real estate focused company, you really need to think about, how am I going to prove this is going to be real and active? So here are some of the E2 real estate ideas that have worked for our clients in the past. So a real estate brokerage, a management company if you're doing property management. So let's say you own some properties and then you are the property manager for those properties, and then you have other properties owned by other people for which you're the property manager. That often, depending on the scope and the size, can be active enough if you're going to be hiring workers to kind of, do the maintenance on the properties. That can be something that works. A renovation or construction company. So, that's another thing that, is kind of, can work, for an E2. And then also house flipping sometimes, but again, on a very large scale. So for example, we had a client who had a portfolio of about 30 to 40 homes on which they were kind of doing renovations, construction, and then selling. So if you have a very large real estate portfolio, and within that portfolio, there's going to be kind of commercial or residential development, that can sometimes work. Or sometimes if you have another type of real estate company, like you're going to be a property manager, but then on this, another smaller service is that the company will be purchasing and, flipping homes. That's something you can add into the business plan to allow you to do both of those things. So these are some ideas that could potentially work. You do want to be really sensitive to licensing. For many of these types of businesses, there are license requirements, often state-specific license requirements. Sometimes, for example, if it's construction, if you need a general contractor's license, sometimes you can only get one of those with a social security number. So if you don't have one yet, maybe your business needs to, have a partnership with another general contractor until you can get into the US and do the work. So there are kind of things you can do to, work around, but you do need to be sensitive to that licensing requirement, and make sure that you've investigated that so that, you can actually run the company if you get the E2 visa. All right, so another kind of high risk area, equity trading companies. So similar to real estate, I think there's the concern about, is this going to be really more passive? Are you just putting your stock portfolio in an LLC? Are you just kind of doing some minimal trading for friends and family? You really need to show that there's going to be enough activity, that there's going to be an active business going on. Similar to real estate, it's a highly regulated industry. You would need to show you have proper licenses. Oftentimes, for example, if it's a hedge fund, the structure may be quite complicated between what is actually operational, what's holding, where's the revenue being made, where the employees being, where the employees being paid through. So you do want to kind of discuss all of that with your immigration attorney to make sure that you're selecting kind of the right entity to be, the entity for E2 investment. And then, making it clear that this is going to be a real and active business, that it's going to hire workers, provide, services. So that's kind of another thing, another area that it's more high risk if you're going that route. All right, so some reasons for E2 denials. So one is low investment amount. So if some investment amounts are just too low. We had a client come to us who had put $98,000 in a business bank account and spent $2,000 and, was denied because the investment was not substantial. So even with, with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, we found they're much more receptive to lower investment amounts. But even for them, that would just be too low. So there, you do need to think about what can I, reasonably argue are the startup costs for this type of business. And, if your investment amount is going to be on the lower side, perhaps provide, market research, industry reports, trade publications, outside research to support that your lower investment amount is sufficient, but also knowing it does have to be of the magnitude that the officer would feel comfortable, that you're going to be committed to developing and directing this business. So that's to say it does need to be, significantly more than $2,000. Other reasons could be the nature of the business. So we just went through some of the risky types of businesses, consulting businesses, real estate, equity trading, kind of more speculative businesses sometimes can, have greater scrutiny on them. Another is filing location or the venue for the application. So it is important to talk with your attorney to discuss what your options are, because there are some places like U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, if a change of status is available for you, they are much friendlier to lower investment amounts, but they have a much stricter rule about the source of funds. Some consulates are more receptive to smaller businesses or lower investment amounts. Canada, London, tend to be quite friendly to investments that, are even in the, $80,000 to $100,000 range, very, very low. Other consulates are not as friendly for that. And another thing to consider is the consular officers do rotate over the years. So trends change, where you had a visa chief who perhaps ran an office that, was more friendly to smaller businesses. Maybe 5 years later, the office is in a different place, and vice versa. Things can kind of become friendlier perhaps over time. If you're going to a consulate where they're used to processing mostly large companies that are making investments of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, if they see a small investment amount of 50,000, they may not be as receptive to that. So you do need to keep in mind, where are you filing and what are the current trends at that consulate? The next two reasons are kind of related. So, these both relate to concerns about the marginality requirement, which requires that the business support more than just the investor and their family. So if you've been running a similar business in your home country for many years and you've never hired employees, they may look at your business plan and say, well, this is all speculative and we see the history, and in this history, you haven't hired people. So that would be something where you may consider hiring employees before you file, because it would really help in that particular situation. The other is just concern that the business is going to create jobs. So, for example, solo consultants, if you're running a consulting company, it can be really helpful to the application to hire someone to help, kind of head off that concern. Other things that could happen, issues with the adjudicating officer. Consular officers are human beings. They are processing, hundreds of visa applications every day. They have very limited time in which they're supposed to make these, adjudications. Sometimes there are officers that really take, very kind of hardline positions that perhaps are not as in line as you would think with, custom practice or the law. That being said, the officer does have complete discretion to, approve or deny the visa. So if you are having an issue with an officer, you want to be as polite as possible, ask, what they were unhappy with. Generally you can reapply, and most consulates will try to give you a different officer the next time. It's not guaranteed, but most of them try to do it. So another reason for E2 denial is just if you maybe you just didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. If you went and, you as the treaty country national, you don't own, 50% of the company, or the company is not, owned by treaty country nationals, that would be a reason for denial. So you do have to meet kind of some of those threshold requirements in order to get the E2. Let's talk a little bit about some adjudication trends and hot topics. So COVID and the E2 visa. So thankfully, this is becoming less of a hot topic, but still worth mentioning at this point. There are still ongoing impacts in the sense that, when COVID, came about, consulates closed down, and then as they've reopened, they've essentially reopened on an ad hoc basis, which means that they're given a lot of discretion over how to reopen, what to prioritize, how to deal with their backlogs. And so there are some ongoing impacts on E2 processing. There are some consulates that have gotten right back into, the normal kind of processing times, like Canada, in Toronto, they're generally dealing, quite reasonable processing times. And then there's some consulates that are still very backlogged. So, for example, in Bogota, they just started accepting e-visa applications again very, very recently, and are working through a backlog from 2020 and 2021. Very, very delayed at certain consulates. So it is important to kind of talk to your attorney and understand what is going on with timing at the various consulates. And some of them are not, some of them are willing to share that information, and some of them are not. So sometimes, it can be difficult to get an exact knowledge of the timing, particularly if you're going to a consulate that's not in an E2 treaty country, or they don't, regularly process e-visas. So most consulates are processing E2 petitions. As I just mentioned, timelines are kind of all over the place. If you're in a situation where you're in the United States, maybe you're already in E2 status, and for some reason, it's not, you can't travel, or you're not able to get an appointment in time, there is an option to extend your status within the United States. So you could file an extension of status with USCIS. The benefit of this is you don't have to travel. The downside of this would be that they will, if you were initially approved at a consulate and now you're submitting an extension, USCIS will view that as a brand new application, and they will want to review your investment. They'll want to review your source of funds. They will not necessarily defer to the approval of the consulate. If your case was previously approved with USCIS, then there is a deference policy, and they will defer to that prior approval. So, it's good to kind of discuss what are the options there. If you file with USCIS through a change or extension of status, what you would get is an approval notice that allows you to keep working in the US in E2 status for 2 years. It does not permit you to travel internationally, though. And the fact that you got the E2 approval doesn't mean you can go to a consulate and just get a visa stamp. So with some visas, like the H-1B or the L, if you get an approval from USCIS, when you go to the consulate, essentially, they're just rubber stamping, the previous approval. It's not that way for E2 visas. With an E2 visa, if you got a change or extension of status approved, once you leave the United States, you would need to go to a consulate, submit a new E2 application, and they will review it as though it's a brand new application. So some pros and cons to USCIS versus the consulate. We've gone over some of them, but one, for example, with a consulate, you can get a visa stamp that allows you to travel internationally. As Jiyae mentioned earlier, visa stamps can kind of be granted for different periods of time, depending on, which country you're from and the reciprocity schedule there. But for many people, they can get visa stamps that are valid for years, even up to 5 years. So that can be, really great, as opposed to just getting a 2-year approval that allows you to stay in the United States. For people that need to travel frequently, the consulate is going to often be, a much better option. Consulates as well are often not as exacting about the source and trail of funds as USCIS is. For USCIS, they want to see dollar for dollar accounting of exactly where the money went, even if maybe it's inheritance from 20 years ago. They want to see where it was that whole time. So, that can be quite challenging sometimes from a document perspective. So if, for consulates, they're often, satisfied with a more high level, kind of discussion of the source of funds. They don't need to track every single dollar. So if you have a really complex source of funds, sometimes it can be better, to go to a consulate. All right, so it's just some issues that come up. So people often ask, do I have to hire employees, before I apply for the E2 visa? The answer is no, it's not a requirement in the law. That being said, it's often very favorable for the application, particularly if you have other weak spots in the application. And there are some consulates, again, like some of those consulates I was mentioning that maybe process primarily very large companies. There are some consulates that sometimes kind of take the position that you need an employee before you file. You don't, it's not a requirement. We've had many, many cases approved without that. But if you are going to a consulate where that's a current trend, you want to take that into account. Other complex areas, complicated source and trail of funds. So as I was just talking about, USCIS wants that dollar for dollar accounting, exactly where the money went, how it was sustained and maintained. You can't just kind of provide a tax return and say, well, I earned this money last year. They would say, okay, great, show us your bank statement, show payroll coming in, show payroll being maintained. If the money got transferred to different accounts, show us where it went. So they do really want to, see a lot of detail on that. Loans can be used as the source of funds for E2 investment. The one caveat is the loans cannot be secured by the assets of the E2 business. So if you're going to take out a loan, it needs to be either, a loan secured on your own personal assets or on, unsecured loans can also work. But it cannot be secured by the assets of the E2 business, and the E2 business itself cannot take out the loan. You as the investor need to take out the loan. Gifts are also possible for E2 investment, but a gift letter by itself is not enough. You would need the gift letter coupled with proof of where that gift giver got the money. So if the gift giver got it from selling a property, they would want to see, proof of the property sale, proof of the person receiving that money in their bank account and then transferring it, to the investor. People will often ask, can I get two E2 visas for two investors? And you can. If the ownership is 50-50, then both people can be E2 investors. Something else, substantive changes to E2 business after filing. There are some people that, you'll get the visa and sometimes you'll get it for 5 years and think, okay, this is valid no matter what. But it's only valid for as long as you're continuing to meet the E2 requirements. So let's say, you get your E2 visa, but then you own your company and then you sell 80% of it to a US citizen. Now you only own 20%. So now you are no longer meeting the E2 visa requirements. There's some arguments you could potentially use if you did maintain operational control, but those are kind of outlier arguments, and many consulates wouldn't accept them. So if you are in a situation where it looks like your ownership is going to go under 50%, you want to talk to your attorney first before that happens. So you can either plan to move to a different visa type or figure out some other structure, perhaps where you could keep, 50% of the voting shares of the company. But that is something you would need to address. Changes in the type of business as well can be problematic. So the E2 visa is entity specific. And then also when you submit the application, you're saying, I've spent everything necessary to set up this type of business, and this is what I'm going to do. So if you get an E2 visa for running a French restaurant, and now you want to sell that restaurant and start a business consultancy, before you would do that, you would need to go back to the consulate or to USCIS and get an approval to do that, because it's just completely different from what you were approved for. Versus if it was you have you have a French restaurant and now you want to purchase a second French restaurant, that's probably okay, because you're essentially just expanding on what you've already represented to the consulate you're going to be doing. So when you're thinking about changes in the type of your business, you want to think, is this a natural outgrowth of my services? Am I a marketing consultancy that was focused on finance clients, and now I'm, adding a niche to focus on, clients in the art world? Whatever it is, you want to kind of have a conversation before you start that new service line, just to make sure that either it was contemplated in the business plan, or that it's close enough to what you had represented to the consulate, that it's not going to be considered a substantial change that you embarked upon without prior approval. And then finally, family business purchases. This is something that people maybe they want to purchase a portion of a business from a family member or an entire business from a family member. It is possible to get an E2 visa in this situation, but you can expect significantly more scrutiny. And the purchase price needs to make sense in light of the value of the business as represented on the tax returns and financial statements. So if you have a business that's making, a lot of money, has a lot of income, has high assets, and you're saying, yeah, my brother will sell this to me for $30,000. They're going to look at that, and say, is that really the fair market value for this type of business? So if you're doing a family business purchase, it's often helpful to have a CPA or an independent, company do a valuation of the company, just to show that whatever amount you invested is the objective, market value of this company. All right, so I think we've covered everything. So we're now, we can move on to some of the questions and answers here. So I see this one, a mental health and wellness clinic. Yes, you can start a mental health and wellness clinic. That is, like any kind of for-profit business that you're going to, engage in, you can. The average investment amount is, we can't really opine on that here. Like, it's really going to depend a lot. I think that again, like, it's just really going to depend a lot if it's a remote clinic versus if it's one where you're providing on-site services. We have had many clients who've done similar types of businesses, and I think for some of them they've invested somewhere somewhere in the kind of $80,000 to $150,000 range, again depending on exactly what they're doing. It is a service-based business. So, arguably it'd be lower investment amounts than like a manufacturing company, but it's just really going to depend on the specifics of your business. So you kind of need to think about, what would I actually need to get this business up and running? What are my expenditures going to be? And that's going to be kind of where your starting point is. All right. So I think those are all the questions that we have. Can wait a couple, maybe 15 more seconds or so to see if anyone else comes in. So if you do have a question, just do I need a bachelor's in accounting or business administration to apply for an accounting E2 visa company? No, you don't. There is no degree requirement for the E2, but they will want to see that you're able to develop and direct the company. So depending on what type of accounting business it is, if it's the type that requires, for example, like a professional corporation or a professional limited liability company based on having a CPA, then that might be, a requirement. So it just depends. But for a general accounting firm that's not requiring, an extra professional license, you don't need that degree. Yeah, you don't need a degree for that. So if a business value is 1 million, what amount do you think is good to invest? What percentage of the business value? Jiyae, I'm not sure if you want to talk about this one, or I'm happy to do it as well.
Yeah, if you can just, finish it.
Yeah, so I think that ultimately, the lower the investment amount, the higher the percentage of the investment needs to be. So the examples they give in the regulations are, if you invested, $100,000, you need to invest, 100% of the cost, versus if it was $100 million, a $10 million investment may be sufficient. I will say that for $1 million, we have seen cases where maybe the business is valued around 4 million and someone invested around $1 million and it was not found to be substantial. So I think even for an investment of that magnitude, you want to be investing, the highest percentage that you can, for starting the business.
I can take the next one. Yeah. So one of our clients accepted for E2 visa. Did they need licensing for practicing? So this really depends on the state that you are going to practice. You're going to set up your practice, right? And it also depends on, what the restrictions are for that particular state in that particular profession, right? So if you need in some cases, you may need to register the company somewhere and license, or in some cases, they were only allow companies owned by licensed professionals to, provide certain services in particular fields. So it really depends on the specific type of services that you would like to provide with your E2 business. And for that, yeah, research will be necessary to determine that, you know, you're in compliance. We unfortunately cannot find that out for you.
So what industries don't require a background in the field of investment? Jiyae, I'm sure, do you want to take this one?
What industries don't require a background in the field of investment? So, right. So for example, if you're, you know, providing consulting services in an area of your specialty. So if it's, you know, you are an IT engineer and you're providing engineering consulting services, that you don't necessarily need a background in the field of investment to be able to lead and direct a company that provides IT engineering services. So again, it really depends on, you know, the type of services that you would offer for your business. And for example, you can even, you know, operate a franchise, you know, for, you know, fast food franchise, or, you know, a lawn landscaping franchise, or, you know, you know, smoothie juice franchise, for example. For those things, you know, you don't necessarily need a background in investment, but maybe just general business professional experience, managerial experience in any capacity could, you know, be sufficient to prove that you have the right amount of knowledge to make that happen. So yeah, the answer is that you don't necessarily need a background in investment itself to invest in a business to qualify for the E2 visa. All right, so it seems like those are all of the questions. Thank you everyone for your participation. If you have more questions, definitely feel free to schedule a consultation with us. We will be happy to look at your individual case in more detail, and we'll be able to provide all of the guidances, you know, that is relevant. We just had one more question, come up. You want to take it, Kelly?
Yeah, I'm happy to kind of. So, I mean, ultimately, this is one of the riskiest things about the E2. Like the government requires that you put your money at risk and irrevocably commit it. It is possible that you invest the money and you do not get approved. There are things you can try to do to mitigate risk. So, for example, if you're going to purchase a business as opposed to start up a brand new business, you can use something called an escrow arrangement, where instead of transferring the money directly to the seller of the business, you would just put the money into an escrow account. You would execute the purchase sale agreement. So it would be a binding contract. And basically, the escrow agreement would say all conditions for this sale have been completed except approval of the E2 visa. If the E2 visa is approved, money will go to the seller. If the E2 visa is denied, money will go back to the buyer. So when you're purchasing a business, there's a lot more ability to protect yourself. When it comes to starting up a business, I think there's less ability to protect yourself other than keeping all of the receipts, you know, buying things that are potentially refundable, you know, equipment, things like that. But there would be some loss, obviously. That is unfortunately part of what they do want to see to show that you are committed to developing and directing the company. All right.
All right. Thank you, Kelly, for sharing your expertise. Thank you, everybody, for your active participation. And yeah, we will close here. Thank you.
Thank you.